Kunar Province, Afghanistan, October 25, 2007. Somewhere near the village of Landigal, on a radio channel American signals intelligence had been quietly monitoring for weeks. An unidentified Taliban commander says something to his men that a U.S. intelligence officer will later write down, word for word, because it will turn out to be almost prophetic. If they're not leaving by helicopter, the voice says, they're in trouble. He is talking about a platoon of American paratroopers who, at that exact moment, are half a mile down a switchback trail lined with holly trees, walking home in bright moonlight after 6 days in the mountains. He believes they are trapped. In about 11 minutes, he's going to find out he was almost right, and also, in the way these things go, catastrophically wrong. This is not the version of that valley you've seen in a war movie. There's no swelling music at the ambush point. There's a medic bleeding out from a wound to the leg while radioing instructions for his own treatment. There's a 22-year-old from Iowa doing the simplest, most terrifying thing a soldier can do, running toward the gunfire instead of away from it, and later telling a reporter he still isn't sure that counts as heroism. And there is, threaded through the whole story, a strange kind of respect that grew between two enemies who spent 15 months trying to kill each other in 6 square miles of Afghan mountainside, and who, when the Americans finally left, each claimed they were the ones who'd won. Both of them had a case. Start with who was on the other end of that radio. By the fall of 2007, the fighters holding the Korangal Valley were not a ragtag militia. Analysts working the area described a mixed force. Local Korangali and Pech Valley tribesmen defending their own ground, seasoned Taliban commanders rotated in from Pakistan's tribal areas, and in the earlier years of the war, foreign fighters with Al-Qaeda who'd fought the Soviets in these same mountains 2 decades before. Some of the older commanders operating along the Pech and its tributaries had, in fact, learned this terrain fighting the Red Army in the 1980s, when this stretch of Kunar had already earned a reputation for swallowing invading armies whole. They knew the ground the way Americans knew their own neighborhoods. They knew which ridgelines gave a sniper a clean shooting lane onto a combat outpost, and which ravines let a rocket team fire and vanish before a mortar crew could range them. They used the civilian population genuinely, not as a talking point, as cover, moving fighters and weapons through compounds where women and children were present, which meant American commanders were constantly forced to choose between restraint and risk. It is, by any honest military reckoning, one of the most difficult defensive positions Western forces fought over in the entire 20-year war. That's the resume of the force the 173rd Airborne Brigade was sent to face down. It matters because everything that follows is not a story of an easy enemy. It's the opposite. The 173rd Airborne Brigade was born on the island of Okinawa on March 26, 1963, activated as the U.S. Army's quick reaction force for the entire Pacific Theater, built around 2 battalions descended from the 503rd Parachute Infantry Regiment, a unit that had jumped into combat in World War II. Taiwanese paratroopers training alongside them gave them a nickname that stuck for the next 60 years, Tien Bing, Sky Soldiers. In May 1965, the 173rd became the first major U.S. Army ground combat unit sent to Vietnam. They fought for 6 straight years, DAC to War Zone D, the only combat parachute assault of the entire war, and came home in 1971 having earned 13 medals of honor and lost more than 1,500 men. Then the brigade was deactivated. For almost 30 years, the Sky Soldiers existed only as a memory patch on old men's jackets. They were reborn in 2000, based out of Vicenza, Italy, and in 2003 they wrote themselves back into the history books. The 173rd conducted the U.S. Army's only combat parachute jump of the Iraq War, dropping into northern Iraq to open a second front. By 2007, they were a brigade that understood itself culturally as a unit that arrives by air into places other units are reluctant to go. When they deployed to Kunar Province for a 15-month tour that spring, that self-image was about to be tested against the single most contested 6 square miles in the entire Afghan theater, the Korangal Valley. An officer who cycled through this same stretch of Kunar a few years later put it plainly to a historian. It is, he said, almost a lost cause up there. You need far more than a platoon if you actually want to change anything. That verdict, spoken with the tired honesty of a man who'd lived it, hangs over everything that follows. 2nd Platoon Battle Company, 2nd Battalion, 503rd Infantry Regiment, the men called themselves the Celts, moved into the valley in the spring of 2007 and built a 15-man outpost on a barren hilltop with no running water, no phone line, and often no electricity. It would be attacked on average 4 to 5 times a week, some weeks 5 or 6 times a day. On July 22, 2007, 3 months into the deployment, a dismounted patrol moving through the village of Aliabad walked into small arms fire. The platoon medic, 20-year-old Private First Class Juan Sebastián Restrepo, a Colombian immigrant who'd enlisted in the U.S. Army and trained at Fort Sam Houston and Fort Benning before joining the unit in Vicenza, lifted his head to check on the men around him and was hit twice in the face and neck. He stayed conscious long enough to try to direct his own first aid. He was stable when the medevac helicopter took off. He died of his wounds before it reached the hospital. His friends called him Doc. Sebastian Junger, the journalist embedded with the platoon, would later write that Restrepo was loved because he was fearless under fire and off the battlefield endlessly generous. He'd take another man's guard shift if he was sick, and if a soldier was struggling, Restrepo would show up at his bunk with a guitar. 2 months after his death, the platoon built a new outpost near the spot where he'd been hit and named it in his honor, Outpost Restrepo. It would give its name to an Academy Award-nominated documentary and eventually become one of the most recognized place names of the entire Afghan War, a 15-man hilltop that took enemy fire almost every single day it was manned. The valley did not let up. By that autumn, Battle Company was preparing for its most ambitious mission of the tour. Operation Rock Avalanche launched on October 19, 2007. A 6-day battalion-scale push through the Korangal, Shariak, and Chapadara valleys meant to disrupt Taliban command structures and destroy weapons caches before winter closed the mountain passes. It would turn into the deadliest week of the deployment. On October 23rd, a position on a ridge the soldiers called Hancho Hill, on Sotelo Sar Mountain, was overrun. Staff Sergeant Larry Raugel, a 25-year-old Army sniper from West Jordan, Utah, was killed by small arms fire. Raugel was on his 6th combat deployment, 3 tour in Iraq, 3 in Afghanistan, a career soldier who had enlisted at 17, straight out of high school over his father's quiet worry. His father, Ismail, had served in Vietnam. His uncle had served in the Gulf War. Both men, his mother would later say, understood exactly what war cost. Weeks before this deployment, Larry had pulled his mother aside and told her he didn't think he'd be coming home this time. She told him not to talk like that. When he was killed, a documentary crew embedded with the unit was close enough to capture on camera the moment his squad mates found his body, footage that would become one of the rawest scenes in Restrepo. He left behind a 3-year-old daughter named Carmen. He had planned to take her to Disneyland on his next leave. 2 days later, on the evening of October 25th, 1st Platoon was providing overwatch on a ridge called the Gadigal Spur, while 2nd and 3rd Platoon moved to recover equipment the Taliban had captured after Raugel's death. As 1st Platoon began pulling back toward Outpost Vimoto in bright moonlight, 10 to 15 enemy fighters sprang an L-shaped ambush from less than 10 meters away, the range at which the intercepted commander had told his men the Americans would be trapped. The platoon's medic, 29-year-old Specialist Hugo Mendoza, was shot through the femoral artery in the opening seconds. Mendoza, a church-going, food-obsessed, endlessly cheerful El Paso native who joined the army planning to become a firefighter and had, by his brother's account, started talking about making the military a 20-year career, kept working. According to accounts from soldiers who were there, he was still responding to calls of medic as he went down, trying to reach his squad leader, Sergeant Joshua Brennan, who had been dragged forward by the attackers. Mendoza died of his wound. Brennan was killed in the same engagement. It was into this collapsing ambush that 22-year-old Specialist Salvador Giunta of Hiawatha, Iowa, ran forward under sustained machine gun and small arms fire to reach his squad leader, believing him wounded, and then continued forward alone when he saw 2 enemy fighters dragging a 2nd American soldier away into the dark. Giunta closed the distance, killed one of the fighters, wounded the other, and recovered the wounded American before directing casualty evacuation until reinforcements arrived. 3 years later, in 2010, he would become the first living American to receive the Medal of Honor since the Vietnam War. When reporters called him a hero, Giunta pushed back on the word almost every time. "In this job, I am only mediocre," he told one interviewer. "I did what I did because, in the scheme of painting the picture of that ambush, that was just my brushstroke. Every soldier who goes into the unknown," he said, "deserves the same word people want it to hang only on him." Accounts differ slightly on the exact sequence of who reached whom first in the chaos of that ambush. Night, adrenaline, and years of retelling do that to a firefight, but the documented outcome does not. 1 American killed outright, 2 more mortally wounded, and a Medal of Honor earned in the 11 minutes an unidentified voice on a Taliban radio had predicted would trap the platoon for good. Analysts who studied the Korangal insurgency and Afghan and Pakistani commanders who fought there kept coming back to the same idea, expressed in different words. This valley did not require them to defeat the Americans in open battle. It only required patience. Local fighters called the strategy, roughly, Sabr wa Zaman, patience and ground, the idea that a small, mobile, locally rooted force could outweigh a technologically superior occupier simply by making every meter of territory expensive year after year, until the political cost in Washington and Vicenza outpaced whatever the valley itself was worth. It's not a term you'll find in an American field manual. It's closer to a folk doctrine, repeated by fighters and elders across a dozen wars fought in these same mountains, going back to the British and the Soviets before the Americans ever arrived. Whether or not any single commander wrote it down, it was, in effect, the plan, and it very nearly worked exactly the way it was supposed to. The 173rd second deployment to Kunar in 2008 would produce the valley's bloodiest single day. On July 13, 2008, in the neighboring Weigel Valley, a 40-man platoon from Chosen Company, the same battalion, the 2nd of the 503rd, had spent 5 days building a combat outpost near the village of Wanat, working with roughly 24 Afghan National Army soldiers to secure the site for a planned road project. Before dawn, an estimated 200 Taliban and allied fighters, some reports suggest as many as 500, attacked from 3 directions at once, using the village's own houses, shops, and mosque for cover to get within grenade range before opening fire. The assault targeted the position with brutal precision. Within the first hour, an observation post called Topside, manned by roughly 9 soldiers, was nearly overrun. Incoming fire destroyed a tow missile launcher and much of the platoon's heavy weaponry before the defenders could use it. First Lieutenant Jonathan Brostrom, 24, of Aya, Hawaii, the platoon leader, a University of Hawaii ROTC graduate who'd been in command only since the previous summer, was killed leading a small team forward to try to relieve the pinned-down observation post. Weeks earlier, a military historian visiting the unit had asked Brostrom how the mission in Nuristan was going. His answer on the record was almost a warning. "It's nearly a lost cause up here," he said. "You'd need a lot more than a platoon to make a real difference." By the time American artillery, attack helicopters, and fixed-wing air support broke the assault, 9 U.S. soldiers were dead and 27 wounded, the worst single-day American loss of the entire Afghan war to that point. Staff Sergeant Ryan Pitts, badly wounded and nearly the last man standing at Topside, continued directing artillery fire and holding the position until reinforcements arrived. In 2014, he would receive the Medal of Honor, one of the last living recipients from either the Iraq or Afghanistan campaigns. The U.S. claimed at least 21 enemy fighters killed, though in the pattern typical of this insurgency, the attackers largely carried their dead away before dawn, leaving almost nothing behind to confirm the toll except 2 bodies and a battlefield stripped clean of nearly everything they'd used. Wanat became, in the years afterward, the subject of a formal army investigation and years of professional debate about whether the outpost had been given the resources it needed. It also became, for the men who survived it, the clearest single proof of what the enemy's patience and ground doctrine could achieve against a numerically small American position, however well trained. By the spring of 2010, after nearly 5 years of fighting for 6 square miles of mountainside, and after roughly 42 American lives lost in that stretch of Kunar alone, NATO commanders concluded what the valley had been telling them for years. The Korangal was not worth what it cost to hold. American forces quietly pulled out of the Korangal outpost and its satellite positions that April, folding the effort into a broader strategy of concentrating troops around Afghanistan's population centers instead of remote mountain valleys. Within days, Al Jazeera correspondents walked into the abandoned camp and found Taliban fighters already moving through it freely. A local commander who gave his name as Anwar told the crew that his men had found mortars, rockets, and ammunition the Americans had left behind, material, he said, God willing, they intended to use against them. A local man standing amid the litter of the abandoned outpost said something quieter and more universal. He didn't want Americans, he said, or Germans or any other foreigners. He wanted peace, and he wanted it on his own terms. A U.S. Army colonel, asked about the insurgents' claims of victory, said simply that the possibility of the Taliban moving back in the moment American forces left had been fully anticipated. It was a diplomatic answer to an undiplomatic truth. Both sides could point to the same abandoned hilltop and call it proof of something they'd known all along. Which brings the story back to that radio intercept from October 25, 2007. If they're not leaving by helicopter, they're in trouble, and to the platoon it was spoken about. Most of the men of 1st Platoon did leave the Korangal, eventually, by helicopter in the spring of 2008, when their 15-month deployment finally ended. Sal Giunta left the army altogether in 2011, 4 years after the ambush and 1 year after the White House ceremony that made him famous against his own wishes. He has spent the years since deflecting the word hero in almost every interview he's given, insisting the credit belongs to the men who didn't come home, Raugel, Mendoza, Brennan, as much as to him. Restrepo's name now belongs to a documentary, not a hilltop. The outpost itself was abandoned along with the rest of the valley in 2010, bulldozed flat or left to the weather, depending on which account you read. Wanet's combat outpost collar, named for another young lieutenant killed earlier that same year, lasted only days before the platoon that built it was overrun. None of the ground the 173rd bled for in Kunar province is held by American forces today. By that narrow measure, the only measure some of the fighters on that Al Jazeera tape cared about, the valley outlasted them. But sit with what Outlast actually cost the side that claims it. It cost roughly 200 fighters by the U.S. Army's count in a single night at Wanet alone, most of their bodies carried off before dawn so no one back home would have to see them counted. It cost the valley's own economy, cratered by 5 years of raids and airstrikes. It cost the Korangali people the dubious honor of having their home become a symbol, the Valley of Death, Americans called it, and eventually a punchline for a war nobody back home could quite explain the purpose of. And it did not in the end cost the 173rd Airborne Brigade its name, its history, or its willingness to jump into the next hard place the Army sent it. The brigade rotated through Afghanistan twice more before the war ended, and its soldiers still wear the same nickname the Taiwanese paratroopers gave them in 1963. There is a version of this story where the enemy commander on that October radio channel was right, and the version where he was wrong, and the uncomfortable truth is that both versions are true at the same time. The platoon he thought he had trapped did eventually leave by helicopter, every man of it, the living carried out to finish their tour, the dead carried out earlier still, under flags, to towns in Utah and Arizona and Iowa and Hawaii that had never heard of the Korangal Valley until it took one of their own. The valley outlasted the Americans outlasted the ambush. Both of those sentences are the same size, and neither one cancels the other out. What the Taliban said about this unit in the end wasn't really a boast. It was a bet, a very old bet, the same one made against every army that has ever tried to hold these mountains. That time not firepower decides who keeps the ground. They won that bet. They will tell you so themselves on camera, standing in the wreckage of an outpost named for a 20-year-old medic from Colombia who never got to collect on anything. But ground was never the only thing being measured on that hillside. There is what a valley costs to hold, and there is what a valley costs to take, and there is a third number nobody puts on either side of the ledger, what it costs a 19-year-old to run toward gunfire for a friend, and keep running, long after the smart money says he should have stopped. The valley kept the ground, it never once got that.